Jonathan, welcome to Succession Stories. I'm so glad you're here today. I had a great conversation with you on your podcast, and I'm so glad to turn the mic around and bring you on here today.
Thanks a lot, Laurie. Glad to be here today.
I want to start with learning about your family's business, Joseph H. Cohn and Sons. Tell us about the company, what they did, and its family business legacy.
Gotcha. So my grandfather and his two brothers and their father, Joseph, started a business really around the early 1900s. I have pictures that I've seen of my grandfather and his brothers, age 9, 11, and 13, selling men's suits, three-piece men's suits for $9.99, if you can believe it.
Amazing.
And hustling on the streets of New York to get those suits sold. Ultimately, they built this into a very large clothing manufacturing business. I think a big inflection point was in World War II when they supplied overcoats to the Army and did a massive amount of orders. Another inflection point was when they opened up a very large factory in North Philadelphia in what is an urbanly depressed area. There's actually a huge blog post on God, I can't even think. It's not Reddit, but it's one of those where a blog where someone actually did an enormous research project on the business. And I learned almost as much from that as I knew from growing up in it. But my family was very successful in their business. When I went to visit my grandfather, it was always in the heart of New York City. He always lunched at the fanciest place, which was the 21 Club. And he had very fancy offices, and they were basically executive offices with a showroom. I actually never walked into the factory, but I understand that their factory had over 2,000 employees and over 1 million square feet of floor space in the United States, 500,000 of which was at, I think, Lehigh and Broad in North Philly. And so this business was very successful. The research that I came across suggested that they actually sold the business in 1969. So I was 11 years old, and they got lifetime employment contracts as chief administrative officer, chief executive officer. And I mean, the three brothers, they worked in those offices until my grandfather was basically where his dementia was so bad that he really couldn't work. And so he died when he was 93 in 1992. And any opportunity for me to work in that business, like it would have been a great opportunity for me to have been a fourth generation entrepreneur, family business leader. But a lot of the sons didn't go into the business. None of the daughters went into the business at that time. And my father, who was a son-in-law, went into the business. But, I guess it wasn't, I don't know. It's not that it wasn't that he was bloodline, but he passed away when he was 35, when I was 2 years old. So he died in 1960. The business continued to go on. And it really just closed down their doors in like the late 80s or 86, I think it was. They closed their doors in Philadelphia because there wasn't a successor to take it, to a new place, because it really would have meant everything being offshore in terms of manufacturing. I mean, it would have been so disruptive to the way they currently did business. And their business was a relationship business. So, I mean, it worked fine when my great grandfather passed. But by the time my grandfather and his brothers were passing, there really was no one to take the torch at that point. So, but a very successful company,
Yes, there sounds like it. And it's so unusual to hear if the acquirers say to the owners, you've got a lifetime employment contract. That's like the Supreme Court of
Right.
of manufacturing. It just that's amazing. Yeah, and it's a sad story. I mean, it's a successful story, but then ultimately it is a sad story that the company just closed at its peak. How big was it in terms of revenue?
I think the research that I came up with was that in 1969, they did $30 million in revenue.
Wow.
So that would probably be $350 million in today's dollars.
Yeah, it's impressive.
Yeah.
So you have an entrepreneurial gene in your family. It was handed down, and you never worked there, as you said, but you got started with
No.
entrepreneurial ventures pretty much when you finished college, right?
And yes, and an entrepreneurial and an artistic gene, I might add. My grandfather actually got up every morning, supposedly at 4 a.m., went upstairs to his one of his rooms where he painted, and he painted for an hour before he went to work.
Wow.
And actually, he was a prolific painter, and had a couple of shows at the Whitney Museum because probably mostly because he was friends with the owner and founder of the Whitney Museum, and who also owned the New York Mets at the time, whom he had baseball like season tickets right behind her box. So, it was a quite impressive background. Yeah. So when I got out of college, I, like maybe a lot of young people, wanted to change the world, Laurie, and I was idealistic enough to think that I could change the world, and that my whole thing was about fighting for social and economic justice. And that kind of morphed into then, well, maybe I could do good while doing, do well while doing good. Mostly it was focused on doing good. So I was involved in a lot of nonprofit, community-oriented, cause-oriented activities before I decided to get into a real entrepreneurial business on my own. That was an art and clothing business. So in 1986, 6 years out of college, I thought to myself, I ran into someone who was, I thought, a terrific artist and a very entrepreneurial, and he was doing his art on clothing and calling it wearable art. And sometimes he would do it on fabric and canvases and furniture. And I thought to myself, this might be it. Like, this is me doing clothing business, following the art that my grandfather did, my mom, my mom was my grandfather's daughter. She also was an artist. So I thought, this is something that's in my blood. And I partnered up with this guy, and I tried to borrow money, or get my family, my grandfather, to invest. And I got a letter from his accountant basically saying, your grandfather's really, like, he's too old and he's too basically senile, or, to be able to even consider something like this. And, I wish you all the best in your venture and good luck. And, well, it's a good thing he didn't invest in that business, Laurie.
Uh-oh. What
Oh,
happened?
well, so this artist, who had basically grown up on the streets of Hollywood, a pretty rough existence, um, he turned out to be not that honorable of a person. And he had kind of hoodwinked me into, let's open up a store, which I thought was a great idea. And then let's start going downtown and doing manufacturing. And the store was a good idea because down in the basement was a huge room to produce these hand painted wearable art fashions. And he, and then an apprentice, and then a couple of apprentices, they were painting and doing really good stuff until drugs entered the scene. And specifically, I think it was LSD and cocaine, and maybe it was even meth. I don't even know back then, but he kind of went off the rails with his drug habit, and I didn't see it, and I wasn't that well aware of it, but like, he was determined to have me invest as much money as I possibly would invest, and he would ride this out. And so we had that going. Then we jumped into, let's see if we can manufacture these things so that we don't have to create them one by one. But that didn't translate. Hand painted stuff and manufactured clothes, like, there's a huge gap. It just didn't work. Um, and then, it was a few other things, like a big opening that we did on the streets in Venice that attracted hundreds of people, and where he painted women that were actually naked, and did a boardwalk kind of we had a guy who was like a pro frisbee guy. We had a musician that we had signed as an artist, and we're representing, and he played. And I just thought, like, this is a great party, but like, this is like the beginning to the end. So it didn't last past the summer in Venice. I came home and basically shut it down. because I knew that it just was going to be a really bad investment.
It's a
So
cautionary tale
it
about
is.
partnership.
Yeah.
You didn't know that he was going to just, have you be the banker,
No.
and that he was going to be happy to spend your money.
No. And I didn't also know that he had a wife and 2 children that were living in Maui that then came over to Venice Beach, California, and started living also in the upstairs loft above the retail store. So it turned into basically a crazy scene because between the womanizing, the drugs, and the determination to spend whatever money I would put on the table, I thought this is a really bad partnership, you know. And this is the difference between like a family business, probably, and a non-family business. Had this been a family business, I would have probably known of his history, and I didn't really know his history that well. I was just really captivated by his art. Everyone said, "Oh my God, he does the best stuff on." He literally took like great masters like Picasso and Ben Shahn and Chagall, and he interpreted these and he did them on t-shirts and leggings and leather jackets and silk. And I mean, he just painted everything, including naked women's bodies. And it was like, this is just too funny. It was a lot of fun, but it was kind of reckless.
Yeah,
And
probably not the business venture to
no,
move you forward. It was more like Studio 54.
very much. And it was at that time, it was the 80s when it was quite
Yeah,
called the Tom Wolfe era. It
live
was
it
quite
up.
a party
Yeah.
scene. Yeah.
So tell me about the bridge from where you were getting started in your
Yeah.
entrepreneurial ventures to how you became an advisor
Yeah.
to folks that you've defined as disruptive successors.
Yeah. So that lesson taught me that I need to go back to business school and learn how business is really done. And I sought out specifically USC, University of Southern California, that is, because they had one of the top entrepreneur programs in the country and still do. And from there, I got into the entrepreneur program. I was also really interested in management consulting and family business. So I took courses in those areas. And then I went and worked for a consulting firm that was a small business consulting firm in the community. It basically was a business and economic development firm. And so I was involved in working with tens, literally thousands of businesses over the next 10 years. And we grew that business from 3 to 30, 40 people, from literally $100,000 that we borrowed from the chamber and nothing in assets. We took it to a 10 million asset, $4 million a year company. And then I decided I needed to go out on my own. And I started advising small and growing businesses, some medium sized, some actually pretty large. Eventually, after doing this for like 30 years, I look back and I said, who are my best clients and who are the clients I really liked working with? And they were all family businesses. And then I noticed that there were 2 types of family business members. There was the older, they were 55 to 70 years old, and they were great to sit around and talk with, but they weren't particularly coachable. And then there was this younger generation, and they were 25 to 40, and they were a successor that wanted to take over the next, their father, mother, their parents' business. And what I found was they were much more coachable. And when they hired me, the assignment lasted much longer. An assignment with the dad or mom, parents, might have lasted 6 months. The kid, let's call him Junior, wasn't particularly as engaged. When Junior would hire me, it would last for years. And so that's when I decided that's my niche. I'm basically a scaling up, a growth coach. I've been involved in entrepreneurial operating system, EOS, and different communities of coaching, and decided I'd write my own book called Disruptive Successor, a guide to driving growth in your family's business, and target that next generation leader, that millennial 25 to 40-year-old who really wants to 2 to 10x the business. And it's made sense.
I think it definitely makes sense. And I can relate to it as I was thinking about this show. And so for the fans that remember my my trailer and the introductory comments about the show and the inspiration of it was about this baton and what happens when the next generation gets the baton. And a big inspiration for me was working for a third generation leader who at the time was in his 60s. So he had watched his grandfather found the company, and then his father worked in it. And with each generation, they did something different in the industry. And this was a transportation logistics company. And it started out as a horse and pulling vegetables and fruit. And then it was trucking and warehousing. And then it was the birth of reverse logistics, which is a major part of the 3PL industry. And I was reflecting on that in these, the inspiration for the show and the conversations that we have, because it's about, I think, innovation, growth, and transition. And the concept of a disruptive successor is so important in that, because also as we think about the corporate life cycle and when we get to the maturity curve, that you can either go on the downside and let it continue to go down, or you're going to pull back and come back to your entrepreneurial roots, which is difficult, right? We've talked a lot about third generation, how difficult in the US it is to get to the third, and then beyond that is even more challenging. And one of my guests on the show had said that spouting whales get harpooned. And that theme has recurred enough times that I wanted to ask you about it. Your observations of the family dynamics when it comes to that next generation saying, okay, I've got the keys. I want to innovate. I want to do something different. Does the leader, call it the parent generation above, give them truly the freedom to do that? Or do they hold back and say, no, don't screw it up?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very interesting question, and I can only answer it with anecdotal data. And my anecdotal data is those parents who have relinquished the power, the control, the authority to their children, and those children who have the entrepreneurial drive to take it to a next level, those have been clients that have stayed with me in excess of 6 months. And on average, they're 41 months. So where they were when I last checked. So 4 or 5 years. I mean, I'm going on my 8th year with one of my clients right now. And I've had several that were 8-year-long engagements. The ones where the parent won't let go, hasn't nurtured the confidence in their child. The child doesn't have the confidence, or the parent doesn't believe the child can take over. Those assignments have usually come from the parent. And after, they've hired me to coach that person for 6 months, and we've sort of shook hands at the end and said, good luck. Like, I'm not sure they're really ready. And maybe they'll be ready if they get more mature down the road. And so, maybe I wasn't the right coach at the right time, or maybe they just weren't ready. It's hard to say, but I think it's a big issue. If you're going to transition a business to the next generation, then you have to treat that next generation, whether it's family or not family, even if you're going to sell the business or pass it along, you have to look at that business from an outside perspective, and you have to make yourself dispensable to the company. And that is just like the hardest thing for a lot of entrepreneurs to do, because an entrepreneur, at least these types of entrepreneurs, created it not with the idea that they're going to build it to sell. They built it to create maybe a certain amount of freedom in their life. And they built it around themselves and their abilities and their capabilities. And they maybe don't have a lot of trust in people. And so not trusting people means they can't let go. And if they, and this trust, by the way, not just extends to their employees, but it extends to their family member. I just don't believe or trust that, Junior, I hate that term, but for lack of a better word, that he or she is going to be able to make the right decisions. And part of the challenge, Laurie, is that it's generally the predecessor's money that the successor is gambling with, right? Most of the equity or assets or business or whatever. I mean, most of that is the predecessor's business and money and assets. And, I mean, how many parents do you know that are willing to say to their kids, okay, you manage my money. Okay, you make decisions. Because a 30-year-old, who has a long runway ahead of them, right, in terms of life, they'll bet the farm much more quickly than a person who's 60, who's looking at retirement, is like trying to just make sure that the seeds or whatever the seed corn they have at the farm is going to, fill their plate and take care of their mortgage for the next 15 or 20 years while they're still remaining. I mean, so their risk tolerances are very different, and that's part of what makes it challenging. So I think it's risk tolerance, but I think ego and control probably plays an even bigger part in why businesses don't transition to the next generation or at all.
Yeah, or at all. That's a good point. A lot of companies don't sell. Some people are surprised by that. There's lots of reasons why that is, but if it's not transferable, it's not going to have value to another person or entity. There's so many things we could unpack about what you just shared, Jonathan. The confidence in the next generation and the risk tolerance is a huge part of that. I wonder if it would be a different dynamic, let's say from the founder versus the next gen, because if it's not the founder, they're at least a little more separated from that initial emotional tie, right? As the founder, sometimes
Yeah.
we can relate, there's certainly more of a control element, and letting go dynamic, it can be a little more extensive versus as you get further and further away from that founder emotional tie.
Right.
So do you think that has anything to do with it?
I do. I don't have as much experience in this area because most of my clients are G2, Generation 2 leaders. But those clients that I can look back on that were G2 leaders that had a son or sons and daughters in the business, if it had already transferred fairly successfully from G1 to G2, if G1 did a really good job of mentoring G2 and empowering G2 and giving them confidence, then G2 has been mentored in a way that he or she can now mentor the next generation, G3. And so I think it's so much about what we learn from our parents that we pass on. Nobody wants to think that they're a lot like their mother or father, maybe because they want to think that they've sort of, I don't know, gone out on their own and done it better or done it differently. But I have to say, I mean, I don't think I'm a lot like my mother. And sometimes it really, it irritates me that I'm like that, but I think that we are. And so I think a lot of it just comes down to how well or how were you mentored by your parent before you?
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, I read your book and I appreciate you sending me a copy. It was a really good read. And some of the concepts are the nuts and bolts of running a good business, how to make
Right.
your business a better business and more enjoyable business to run. And that's a good message for anyone, whether you are the person who just bought the company and you're going to now run it as the disruptive successor from the outside,
Yep.
or if you're family.
Yep.
It's a good idea to have a more healthy business, and you provide a lot of insights around how to do that. It strikes me that there's sort of two paths here. One is I'm going to run this business more successfully because I'm mindful of the next generation, or I'm going to run this business more successfully because I might want to sell it one day to a third party. Do you think that family members have an openness to that fork in the road, or those options, or do they
I
really just pick a path and go?
I think they do. I think there's an awareness that they took over this business that was not really sellable, but it was transferable to the children, and that the children being really involved have built it into a business that has more sellability. It's got better systems, it's got better people, better processes, it's larger because if they've been working with me for 8 years, they've probably 10x the business by now, right? And that means, I mean, even if they started with 10 or 15 employees, they've got 150. Those are most of the clients I work with, by the way, they come to me by the time when they're between 10 and 50. and they're starting to put these processes into place. And when they leave, they're a couple of hundred or more. So I think that they're looking at, how do I build real value? And I think also when they're transferring the equity and it's not just being gifted to them, especially when they have to buy it or they have to earn it, they understand what the business's value, because they've been through a formal, probably valuation process. And so they now know what it's going to take to get it to the next level. Some people will just take it and keep it at that level, but then they've basically bought, a job. Yeah, I think you said it really well earlier when you said, if they're going to be a disruptive successor, they have to be either involved in innovation, transition, or growth, or all three. And so, like you talked about the transportation company, I mean, you've got to innovate either the business model. You certainly have to innovate in technology, because that didn't even exist before, all the systems that you would put in that area. If you're going to have more families involved in the business, then you're going to need growth, because you got more like $100,000 plus a year salaries, to feed, and families to feed. So you got a 2 or 3x the business just for each family that unit that comes in. And the transition process is also part of that process. I don't cover it as much in my book, but like a sidecar book that would go along with my book, to talk about, how does the equity get transition? Is it through purchase? Is it through gifting? Is it through a combination? And how do you evaluate what it's worth when you transfer it? All those things, and all the emotional issues that come up in for either a founder or the predecessor in letting go. So these are all important issues, I think.
That would be a good sidecar book.
Mm-hmm. You could write that book, Laurie.
I can write that book with you.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the role of governance, the family shareholders, a family board. What are some characteristics of a family board? What are some examples of when it's been used effectively or ineffectively in your experience?
Yeah. So with most, businesses that are just one, and, where there's only first and second generation, the family board is just basically the immediate family members, or anyone who's involved in the business that's been invited in. It's when it starts to get to G3 and G4 and beyond, and this is, I'm sure, where you have more experience, I think, than I, where you're starting to now bring in outside people who are advisors. And it's one thing to have an advisory board where people are just basically giving their input, and maybe they're being paid or compensated for it, but they're not an officer of the corporation. It's a different thing when they're a board member and they're an officer of the corporation, and now they've got like an elevated level of fiduciary duties that they need to be accountable and responsible to. And I mean, I would say that in putting together, whether it's an advisory board or a board, you should look at the complementary skills and talents of the members of the board. Do you have someone who's good in finance? Do you have someone who's good in people issues? Do you have someone who's good in operational processes? Do you have someone who's from the industry? Do you have people who have built successful companies that are in other industries? I think, a mix of those and family members who are going to be a part of it makes a lot of sense. But you have to really look at the diversity of the board. And I don't mean just male, female, or younger, or older. It's really more experience and what they bring and their
Yeah,
commitment.
absolutely. I recently, about a year ago, went through an interview process for a family advisory board. Like you said, it's not a fiduciary board, it's an advisory board. But that's what they were looking for. They were looking for different experiences, what each of us would bring to the table. It's a second generation construction company. And so being second gen, right, to your point earlier, it has some interesting dynamics to it. But yeah, it is an effective way to try to help get to that next level. And just rough benchmarks, what I've heard is when, let's say a company gets to around 40 million is when they might want to consider having an advisory board. Is that about what you've seen?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think I've had clients who have been smaller who have tried it, but they've mostly fizzled out. They just there just isn't enough there, maybe in terms of strategic direction or input or finances to cover it. So that sounds about right to me.
Okay. When I was on your show, the Disruptive Successor podcast, one of the phrases that has stuck with me, I loved it. The boat, building your boat, business owners advisory team. Just the analogy is so good. Who's in your boat with you, right? And you and
Yep.
I aim to be in that boat together to help business owners be successful and get ready for transition. So I wanted to just address that.
Yeah.
You work with business owners on this journey to help them grow and scale. And at some point, they're going to consider this proverbial fork in the road of what to do next to transition to family, to sell to a third party. At what point, and this is a question I get all the time, so I'm just asking you because I want to compare. What's the time frame look like, do you think? Are people starting to think about that 10 years out, 5 years out from when they personally are ready to make an exit? Do you see different dynamics in different types of companies? Maybe from
Mm.
that you're working with a lot of second gen, so maybe there's more consistency there.
It seems to me that the standard rule of thumb is 3 to 5 years out is a good planning time frame. Um, this is enough time to be able to double the business. So, and we know, you and I know both as value builder advisors, that a business that is generating 20 million versus 10 million is going to be more than twice as valuable just because of the size. The larger the business is, typically, I think the larger the multiple that will go along with it. And I think that a lot of people come to me in the past and you know, they're much further down the road and they wait till it's 6 months or 18 months and you know, it's harder to move things at that point in time. It takes time to make change in a company. If they come to you with less than 6 months, then you're just putting, as I think the phrase is, you're putting lipstick on a pig if it's a mess of a company. So I think a longer planning cycle is needed. But, unfortunately, I don't have the data at my fingertips. More, Laura, you might. But the vast majority of companies don't ever transition or sell. They probably just shutter their doors. And that's probably because the vast majority of businesses are small businesses. I mean, supposedly 96% of all businesses, maybe this data is old, but they were under $1 million in revenue, and they were a mom and pop. And we're talking about the grocery store, the dry cleaner, and maybe more of these do sell than I realize. But you know, there's quite a few businesses that go to market to sell and actually don't ever close a deal.
Yeah,
So
that's true. Yeah, and the types of businesses you're describing, we call Main Street businesses. The
yeah,
under a million, it's definitely more, call it owner led, more of a job, so to speak. And they've never really intended to transition to anyone else. And then they just typically close. So many of these companies don't have a successor. So that's a natural, you know, next step is that it's going to liquidate because there
hmm
is no successor.
right.
And if they die, then of course it's going to just close. So those are some of the dynamics that for the companies that do want to sell and they put it on the market. And what would be some of the reasons that it doesn't sell? Well, it's kind of a matching problem. Did anyone find it that would be a fit? And that could be part of the gap. But if it's a company that's not generating a lot of cash flow profits, if it's too reliant on its owner, those are also some of the risk natures of it. And is it bankable? There's a lot of reasons why a business wouldn't sell. Is it
Yeah.
really transferable? And in the eye of the buyer, is it going to generate the value that warrants the price? So many times it doesn't sell also because the seller's expectations are just too high and it's just not realistic. And so they decide to keep holding on. And then, of course, one of the other tragic things might happen along the way. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, I do advocate on this show and with my clients that when time is on your side, to work on your transition planning. And for the good reason, as you described, if you can double your business in 5 years, I mean, it's worth it to try to invest that time and get your return on equity and return on assets that you're looking for. And also, just to your point about the data, you mentioned the larger the company, the higher the multiples. And a really interesting chart that I have shows an inflection point quite literally at 25 million in revenue. The chart was pretty flat up until that point, starts to increase. And then at 25 million, the multiples just started to really kind of go up exponentially. So that point is definitely backed up
Yeah, that makes
with
sense to
data.
me. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure.
Um, yeah,
Well,
it's
talking
a
about,
lot to, it's a mindset, right, Laurie? It requires a different mindset to build a business that's seller ready or buyer ready, whatever the phrase would be, right? And so it's a mindset to look at your business, or to be able to look at your business from the outside and look in and say, what's this business worth? I think it's really important for owners, if they don't have that objectivity, to talk to someone like yourself or me and get some input and feedback. And so I went into a business just recently. It's a client of mine, and they're wanting to grow. And I said, like, your place is a mess. It's like a manufacturing technology business. And I said, you need to clean your business up. It's not, you wouldn't even invite a customer or a prospective buyer into your business. So if your business doesn't look good, it's not attractive. I mean, think of the house that sells fastest. It's the one that has great curb appeal. I know when I'm always looking at buying a house, I'm looking first at the pictures. How good is the photography? How good does it look from the curb? If it doesn't have good curb appeal, and if it's a mess inside, if it's cluttered, uh, it's not gonna probably sell. Neither is your house, by the way. So declutter your business, clean it up,
that's a great point.
make it look like it's something that is really attractive. I mean, think, just makes sense.
It's figurative, but it's literal too, right? The
Yep.
scorecards, the performance metrics of the business, getting the metrics looking the way they should
Yep.
directionally. Look, we're looking at trends, we're looking at your future projections. All those things matter. And yes, the physical space matters too. Uh, Walking through warehouses, when there's a well organized, safe environment versus when there's not. I have a client that right now, when he shows his warehouse, it is so well organized, well labeled. It's impressive. And so the most common comment has been, wow, we just haven't seen this before. And it does
Yeah.
make a difference. It
Yeah.
can make a difference.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you an example of how the profitability of a company that's organized like that. It's always been the case that when I go and see a company that's super neat, super organized, charts and metrics posted outside of cubbies or in hallways, or the values of the company, really prominently posted. It's always the case that that company is so much more profitable than its competitive company. So don't
Goes
think
hand in
that
hand. Yeah.
cleaning your business up is just about, like, it's a time waster because we don't have time to do that. No, you need to think about cleaning up the business, because the simpler and more elegant and more um, organized your business is, the more sellable it's going to be.
Absolutely. So winding down, I know you have lots of great quotes in your book,
Yeah.
and I bet that you have a favorite one that you could share with us.
Yeah. So, yeah, one of my favorite quotes is by Buckminster Fuller. And he was a systems thinker and an architect. And he was kind of a little bit of wacky guy. He came up with something called the geodesic dome, which he thought was going to be the ultimate living place. But the quote I use is, if you want to teach people a new way of thinking, don't bother trying to teach them. Instead, give them a tool, the use of which will lead to new ways of thinking. And I have found that the silver bullet tool in my arsenal has been giving people what I call the vital few, trivial many. It's basically practicing the 80-20 principle. And it literally will teach you how to delegate or delete or downshift on some activities so that you can elevate yourself, because you really always should be training your replacement. And so for successors, predecessors, if you're not training your replacement, and if your replacements aren't training their replacements, your business is going to be limited in how much it can scale. So
Absolutely.
that's my favorite quote, Buckminster.
Well, it's a great quote. It's a great takeaway. And I think a super ending message here for folks to, for not only disruptive successors, but anyone working in their business that wants to increase value, whether it's for, exit planning in the next 3 to 5 years or thinking beyond that. Because if we can run more profitable in businesses, we will enjoy it more. We'll have a more healthy environment for ourselves and also for our families and for our employees.
Exactly.
Well, Jonathan, thanks so much for being on. If people want to get in touch with you, what's a great way for them to do that?
Yeah, so the best way is to go to my website, and that's thegoldhillgroup.com. The Goldhill Group, pretty easy to spell.com. From there, you can access my book, you can access my podcast, and you can learn more about me, and you can contact me and schedule a call with me.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a joy to talk to you, and I know we'll be continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Laurie.
So listeners, thank you so much for your support. Catch Succession Stories on your favorite podcast player or YouTube and subscribe to the show. If you want to maximize the value of your business and plan for future transition, reach out to me for a complimentary assessment at meetlaurie.barkman.com. Join me next time for more insights from transition to transaction. Until then, here's to your success.